For the second half of our lecture about Mesoamerica, we're going to start in the highlands of central Mexico near what is today Mexico City. So this region, known as the Basin of Mexico or the Valley of Mexico, was the home of some of the largest urban settlements ever made in Mesoamerica, including the site of Teotihuacan, which is where I took this photograph. So this photograph is taken from the largest pyramid at Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun, and I'm looking north along the Avenue of the Dead, which you can just barely see to the left, toward the Pyramid of the Moon at the north end of the site, of the center of the site, and then behind it, Cerro Gordo is a hill that it looks as though the pyramids were actually built to kind of replicate the shape of the natural hill. So Teotihuacan grew to become one of the most powerful and the largest urban centers in all of Mesoamerica, certainly in highland Mexico, during the Classic period. So the site was actually established right at the end of the formative period, from about 100 before the Common Era to 300 of the Common Era, so roughly 2,000 years ago, the city was established. And by the beginning of the Common Era, 2,000 years ago, it had grown to about 6 to 8 kilometers in size, square kilometers, and 20,000 people. But it grew very, very quickly, and by just a few centuries later, by about 300 of the Common Era, the site had grown to 20 square kilometers in size, 90,000 people, and it ultimately reached an apex of about 200,000 people during the Mesoamerican Classic period. Maybe compared to modern cities, that sounds small, but for the ancient world, this was one of the largest cities, not only in the Americas, but in the entire world. It's a really impressive accomplishment. In fact, I've heard it described as the great sucking sound, because so many people seem to have moved into Teotihuacan. The entire basin of Mexico's population, in a sense, kind of consolidated into this major city, and there were relatively few smaller sites around it. So it really was this huge and powerful place during the Mesoamerican Classic period. There's lots of evidence that the city was carefully planned. The Pyramid of the Sun, the largest structure at the site, is carefully placed over a natural cave. The Avenue of the Dead and the two great pyramids of the Sun and the Moon are carefully angled and carefully measured, probably in reference to the movement of the sun and particular stars and so forth. So it's a carefully planned site, which suggests that there was a lot of social organization behind it. And the site also had an enormous impact on the rest of Mesoamerica, both culturally and economically. The people of Teotihuacan basically established control over a source of high-quality green obsidian called the Pachuca source. Green is a sacred color in Mesoamerica. This particular volcanic glass source of obsidian was really high quality, and because they were able to trade that across much of Mesoamerica while also exporting pottery and so forth, they really established themselves as a wealthy power and ultimately became a military power as well. They were apparently conquering parts of the Maya region. There are some known characters from Maya history, for example, such as one known as Fire is Born, who were apparently coming from Teotihuacan and conquering some of the powerful Maya city-states that we'll talk about in a little bit. And one of the interesting things about that is because they didn't really write histories at Teotihuacan, we actually know more about these conquests from outside the area, from the Maya region, where they wrote more history. So Teotihuacan is an incredible site to visit today. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a massive place. It really takes your breath away to walk through the city of Teotihuacan. I took this photograph standing at the top of the Pyramid of the Moon, looking south along the Avenue of the Dead. You can see just the edge of the Pyramid of the Sun to the left there, and you can also see how it really carefully matches the shape of the natural hill behind it. Keep in mind all of these architectural features are carefully measured, very precise in their size, suggesting that these ancient Teotihuacanos had a regimented measuring technique. They were carefully planning things out on the landscape. And also keep in mind that this is really only the downtown core of the site. Much of the site has yet to be really explored archaeologically. So you can see here really just what was the downtown area. In this plan map of the downtown of Teotihuacan, you can see some of the architectural features I was just talking about. The Pyramid of the Moon is to the north. The Pyramid of the Sun, which is as large in its footprint on the land as any of the great pyramids of Giza in Egypt. That's on the eastern side of the Avenue of the Dead there. And then the Avenue of the Dead, this large, wide causeway, runs for kilometers and goes through the area of these major pyramids that we were just talking about, and also runs past an important pyramid to the south, or a smaller pyramid but also really important and heavily decorated, known as the Feathered Serpent Pyramid. So you can see here also some reconstructions of the population size. These are just estimates. It appears as though the suburbs of the site, which you can't even see in this map, stretched out for kilometers. And though much of the architecture in the downtown was made of stone, the people in the suburbs were probably living in, wattle and daub, thatch roof houses, just like in much of Mesoamerica. So that hasn't preserved well. We don't actually know how big the suburbs were. This was a major urban settlement. Interestingly, in the downtown area that you can see in this map, not only were there plazas and palaces and so forth. You can see there, for example, in the upper left, the palace of Quetzalcoatl. Not only were there palaces for the nobles, but there were also apartment complexes where commoner people lived. So much like in a modern city, if you lived in the downtown but you weren't wealthy, you probably lived in a dense apartment complex of 50 to 100 people. Another interesting thing about Teotihuacan that makes it similar to modern cities is that it had ethnic neighborhoods. Just like strolling through LA, you might come across Chinatown or Koreatown or something, and hear different sounds, hear different languages, smell different foods. In ancient Teotihuacan, there were neighborhoods of different peoples from around Mesoamerica. So, for example, there was a Zapotec neighborhood of people from Oaxaca. There appear to have been some Maya people living near the Pyramid of the Moon for a time. So, in that sense, it was cosmopolitan or ethnically diverse like a modern city. The Pyramid of the Sun is a really impressive architectural accomplishment at Teotihuacan. As I mentioned earlier, it's not as tall, but it's as big in its footprint as any of the great pyramids that you've seen for ancient Egypt. You can see some people for scale here on this photograph to just demonstrate how impressive a structure this is. Keep in mind when it was built and in use, it probably was also plastered and would have really stood out on the landscape and been bright and colorful. It probably also had some kind of temple on top of it made out of perishable materials that is not still visible today, but there is some deposition on top. The last time I was at Teotihuacan, the Mexican government was actually had a team of archaeologists at the top of the pyramid doing excavations. So there's much more to learn about Teotihuacan. These pyramids also have things under them. As I mentioned, there's a natural cave under this pyramid that appears to have been modified and also is really well positioned in terms of the movement of the sun. During particular times of year, beams of light from the sun actually light up the cave underneath, and it's suggested that the orientation of the cave, a nearby river, and this pyramid basically forms the sacred Mesoamerican symbol of a mountain, a river source, and a cave, which refers to the heavens and the underworld and the afterlife and so forth. So there's a lot of symbolism and careful planning to this pyramid. From a practical standpoint, this pyramid also demonstrates the mastery of the Teotihuacano architects. If you look carefully, so it's kind of a three-tiered pyramid, almost like a layer cake. And if you look carefully at the angles and shapes of the tiers of this pyramid, the third tier, the highest tier, is actually at a slightly different angle than the tiers below it. What that does visually is it actually tricks the eye into believing that this huge pyramid is even bigger than it actually is. And I think that's really significant. And it reminds me of the Dansante carvings at Monte Alban, because it suggests that for these Mesoamerican cities that were emerging at the end of the formative and really coming to their florescence during the classic period, spectacle, impressing a visitor, impressing an audience, was part of what justified rulership. So if you were a visitor from Oaxaca or some other part of Mesoamerica, and you came to Teotihuacan for the first time to visit this powerful, distant foreign city, you would have been baffled by the awe-inspiring scale of this pyramid, and partly that's intentional. It is a large pyramid, but it's also it appears to be even bigger than it is. And I think that's in part to inspire awe, perhaps even fear, in the public or in visitors. Another interesting thing about these pyramids, this one shows it to a certain extent. Some I've visited in the Maya region are even more extreme in this sense. The staircases are steep. The steps are high and narrow and dangerous. People fall off these things. In some cases, they've been closed to tourists. In other cases, they've put up like safety ropes and so forth to help you climb. This, I think, is intentional. These pyramids were not built to OSHA standards, right? This is not meant to be easy to climb. I think just the opposite. These pyramids are meant to be difficult to climb, like a mountain. To be the priest that climbs to the top of this pyramid to do a ritual is to sort of go through a rite of passage, to experience a transformation and to emerge at the top, having in a sense kind of suffered and sacrificed to get up there. So there's a lot of symbolism and multi-layered meanings tied up in these Mesoamerican monumental constructions. Here you can see a shot of the Pyramid of the Moon, which is also a very large structure, not as big as the Pyramid of the Sun, but very large. And you can tell if you look in the lower right there that I've taken this photograph from partway up the Pyramid of the Sun. So I'm climbing the Pyramid of the Sun, taking this photograph looking north of the Pyramid of the Moon. There are current excavations going on in the Pyramid of the Moon. Like other Mesoamerican pyramids, this one was built in multiple layers. In fact, it's likely that on ritual calendric events, perhaps every 52 years when the calendars kind of rolled over again and you needed to do a new fire ceremony, these pyramids were added onto, given another layer, and expanded. So there's an archaeologist named Saburo Sugiyama whose team is excavating into these pyramids using mining technology to keep the tunnels from collapsing, and in some cases using like remote control vehicles and so forth. And they're finding tombs, they're finding all kinds of interesting stuff in these pyramids. Now at the southern end of the downtown part of Teotihuacan is an interesting building that's not as big. It's not this huge monumental construction, but it is a pyramid, it's relatively large, and it's very intricately decorated. It's decorated with a Mesoamerican god that was actually celebrated by many different Mesoamerican cultures. Now, it's an interesting mystery of Teotihuacan. We don't actually know who built it. We don't know what cultural group it was. It's been abandoned for millennia. It was abandoned when the Aztecs first discovered it. But interestingly, one of the major gods at Teotihuacan, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and that's an Aztec name, that particular god is celebrated by multiple Mesoamerican societies. So there's that sort of continuity from this relatively early city. And then also, so the feathered serpent is the character you can see with the what kind of looks like a jaguar head and then some feathered kind of crests, sort of looks like a dragon. And then the other character that you can see with the eyes that look like donuts or Cheerios is another representation of a different Mesoamerican god known in central Mexico as Tlaloc, the god of rain or lightning and storms. Now the Maya also celebrated a similar god in some languages called Choc. The Zapotecs in Oaxaca celebrated a similar god known as Cosijo. So this sort of rain and lightning and storm deity is significant around Mesoamerica. Now here you can see a close-up view of one of these carvings of the feathered serpent god. The feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, as the Aztecs knew it, or him, was a god who traveled to the underworld and then traveled back up to the world of the living. He was sort of like a dragon-like character, celebrated by different Mesoamerican communities as this powerful kind of creator deity. And this building, it has these decorated, delicate decorations, and they're so well preserved, in part because it looks as though the building was covered up at some point by rubble. You can see, for example, these shell decorations on the side of the building, perhaps even shell trumpets. This is central Mexico. This is the highlands of Mexico, so seashells would have had to be imported from far away. And why is all this art on the side of the building well preserved? Well, it appears as though at some point during the occupation of the city, this delicate decorated building was actually covered up by a layer of rubble that had the effect of preserving the carvings. That's suggested to some archaeologists that rather than thinking of Teotihuacan as this cohesive, unified culture, instead what we have is a site where there were at least two powerful religious factions. One faction, which has been called a religious cult, dedicated to this feathered serpent god, and another faction, perhaps dedicated to a predecessor of a god the later Aztecs knew as Tezcatlipoca. So this is interesting, I think. We tend to think of these ancient sites as having just sort of one culture, but rather, in Mesoamerica, it appears as though some of these sites had basically a competition going on between religious groups, and that may actually explain the later collapse of Teotihuacan. So what was it that they were fighting over? Well, it looks as though the cult of Quetzalcoatl was heavily dedicated to human sacrifice. The evidence we have for human sacrifice and the followers of Quetzalcoatl can be found in the over 200 burials underneath the relatively small pyramid of Quetzalcoatl at Teotihuacan. These skeletons are not just people who died and were buried. Rather, in some cases, as you can see with the image on the right, they had their hands tied behind their backs. They've been killed in violent ways. In some cases, we can tell from their bone isotopes that they're local. In other cases, they've been, they're migrants from outside the area. And there's further evidence more than just these skeletons of human sacrifice at the site. And one piece of that is that some of these burials, as you can see in the example on the left, actually wear necklaces of human upper jaws. That necklace on the figure on the left is made out of the maxilla of the human skull. That's not the mandible. That's not the bone that would be relatively easy to remove from a human skull. That is attached to the cranium. The maxilla has to be cut off, like sawed off, in this case with a stone tool. So this character on the left has all kinds of interesting stuff going on. You can see modified teeth, which would have been a marker of Mesoamerican beauty. This person was probably a noble, probably a wealthy noble. And then you have a necklace made out of human maxilla, which suggests multiple human sacrifices. And then in the figure on the right, with its hands tied behind its back, you can actually see similar necklaces, but they're fakes, which I think is interesting. That shows that it's not just the actual human maxilla, it's sort of the representation of the human maxilla that's important here. But there are hundreds of these burials underneath the pyramid, and that's been interpreted to suggest that perhaps the cult of Quetzalcoatl was really heavily dedicated to human sacrifice, and that may have been one reason that there was competition within the site between these different cults. Perhaps the rulers of Teotihuacan made this expression of human sacrifice and built the temple of Quetzalcoatl. And then later, perhaps a more kind of corporate group, a more democratic group, a little bit more of a humanist group, not so interested in human sacrifice, basically took over power at the site. And ultimately, there's evidence at the site for it having been burned and perhaps collapsing due to internal conflict. So it could be because of this religious difference that we see. Now, we don't actually know that much about the nobles at Teotihuacan, and this makes them really different than the kings and queens of the Maya region, for example. We do know that people were in charge. Obviously, the city is well organized and well laid out. And some people at the city, such as here at this high-status palace near the Temple of the Moon, some people lived in really elaborate homes. But they didn't really have a lot of writing at Teotihuacan, really anything we recognize as writing, and they didn't show a lot of images of their leaders. So it's uncertain exactly how the city was organized. It's possible that basically leadership was organized into sort of a committee, almost like a large business, rather than in the single personage of a king or queen. At some of these palaces, we can see further evidence of wealth in the elaborate and beautiful wall murals that are painted here. Here you can see some kind of a jaguar or mountain lion creature playing a shell trumpet instrument. But the jaguar is not only playing an instrument, it's also wearing a headdress, which reminds me of the Olmec were-jaguars. This, to me, suggests this could be a person, a leader, a shaman, a religious practitioner of some kind who's got the power to transform into a jaguar. Also notice the different symbols around around this figure, which haven't been interpreted as writing per se, but do appear to be kind of a codified set of symbols, which might be kind of a predecessor to a writing style. Now, the commoners in the downtown part of Teotihuacan didn't live in big palaces. They lived in dense apartment compounds of 100 people, perhaps. The city of Teotihuacan grew so large and so powerful with up to 200,000 people during the Classic period, in part because they were located near, as I mentioned earlier, a very high-quality source of volcanic glass, green Pachuca obsidian, which can be turned into tools, cutting implements, sacrificial knives, etc. It's a very high-quality type of obsidian, and the color green is sacred for Mesoamericans. It represents sort of fertility and nobility and so forth. In fact, you can see the rise of the power of Teotihuacan at other sites spread out across Mesoamerica, because basically at the start of the Classic period, all the obsidian in many of these sites turns green, right? The obsidian at Classic period levels is suddenly green, suggesting that they're in trade relationships with Teotihuacan. Now, much of what we know about Teotihuacan, the names we have for the buildings at Teotihuacan, actually all come to us from the Aztecs. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century and were at war with the Aztecs, and eventually the Aztec Empire fell, the Spaniards went about their process of controlling the New World through the colony of New Spain, in part by taking Aztec translators with them around the rest of Mexico and Central America, and the Aztecs told them the names for things. And it was the Aztecs who told them Teotihuacan had been built by the gods, the names of the different buildings, and so forth. And in fact, we've learned that the Aztecs were essentially practicing archaeology at Teotihuacan. So here, this is a green stone mask, perhaps of the deity, the Great Goddess, this interesting female deity at Teotihuacan. But it was actually discovered at Tenochtitlan, the much later capital city of the Aztecs. So the Aztecs had gone to Teotihuacan, had explored the city, which was by that time abandoned, believed that it had been built by the gods, it was so impressive and large, and actually brought back some artifacts and finds that they recovered from the site. So this particular mask is one of my favorite Mesoamerican artifacts. It's made out of a green stone that's really hard to shape and carve. In fact, it was probably sanded into shape rather than carved per se. Note how the shell has been used for the eyes, and a small disc of Pachuca obsidian for the iris or pupil of the eyes. Note how coral has been used for the teeth, or that maybe spondylus shell for the teeth. Note the different kind of green stone for the massive ear spools. And then also, around the edges at the top, note those holes that suggest this really was a mask that was perhaps tied onto a statue, perhaps worn by a living person, although the eyes are not, they don't allow you to see through them. May have been even tied to a dead person in a burial. We're not sure because the Aztecs brought it back. But this artifact is visible at a museum at the Zocalo in Mexico City today. So Teotihuacan was this incredible city. I like this image because it shows some of these pyramids as they might have appeared when they were painted and decorated and had temples on top of them, and the city was occupied and lively. And it appears to have been a city that had influence elsewhere in Mesoamerica, including in the Maya region. So that's our segue to the ancient Maya. The Maya are one of the better-known Mesoamerican groups. There are also, unfortunately, a bunch of myths about the Maya, such as that they disappeared and so forth. That's not true. There are millions of Maya people today. I've been to the Yucatan Peninsula. Many people there speak Yucatec Maya. I've been to Guatemala. Many people there speak lots of different Mayan languages. We're going to focus in particular on three major classic period sites for different regions of the Maya area: Tikal, Copan, and Palenque, which you can see indicated on this map. Another factor of the Maya that's important to keep in mind is because they wrote so much, they were a truly literate society. We know a lot about their beliefs, we know a lot about their practices, we know about the role that nobility played in ritual and sacrifice. We know about their religion, we know about their creation story through the Maya Popol Vuh. And one of the things we've learned from all of this is that the nobility had a role to play in society. They didn't just live better lives and have more food and live in fancy palaces. They had a job to do. And one of those jobs was to practice auto-sacrifice, basically to sacrifice of their own blood, or in the case of being captured in war, because it was the nobility who marched to war, actually being sacrificed and losing their lives. One of the famous Maya characters we know from history who practiced auto-sacrifice is Lady Shock. Now, this is interesting. Shock is actually perhaps the only word borrowed from ancient Mayan languages into modern English. It means shark. This is Shark Lady. And Shark Lady was famous around different Maya sites in the classic period for practicing a really incredible type of auto-sacrifice, of sacrifice of her own blood. So let's look carefully at the images we can see here. On the right, Lady Shock is being accompanied by her assistant, I believe her husband, who's holding a torch so that at night, from the top of a pyramid, the commoners can see what Lady Shock is about to do. What is she doing? Well, she's pulling a rope laced with acacia thorns through her own tongue. And by doing that, she's actually letting much of her own blood. Your tongue has a lot of blood in it. So she's dripping blood down onto a bowl full of paper that you can see at the lower part of that image. Now, in the drawing of another carving that you can see on the left, she's taken that bowl of bloody paper and she's set it on fire. And from the fire emerges this curl of smoke that the Maya have depicted as a serpent, known as the vision serpent. Perhaps because, in addition to hallucinating from the pain, Lady Shock may be taking hallucinogens so that she can participate in this ritual. So she's set fire to the bowl of bloody paper, and from the smoke emerging from that fire comes the vision serpent. The vision serpent opens its giant mouth, and what comes out of the vision serpent? A ghost. Probably Lady Shock's own ancestor, such as her father or grandfather, has emerged from the mouth of the vision serpent, and now she can communicate with that ancestor. This is her job, this is her role, to give of her own blood in order to communicate with the ancestors, in order to predict the future or make religious and political prognostications. This is a fascinating and beautiful example of the really stark and incredible human sacrifices and auto-sacrifices that were going on among the Mesoamerican nobility. Other evidence of Maya sacrifice can be seen in the form of sacrificial altars that are found at some of the classic period Maya sites. In this case, we have one that shows a picture of a person being sacrificed on the sacrificial altar. So it's a good example of how Mesoamerican art can sometimes be very self-referential. So the Maya region is interesting in part because it sort of began its social complexity and started to have large settlements a little bit later than other parts of Mesoamerica. So one of the first major Maya centers was the site of El Mirador in Guatemala. You can see here it grew to 6 kilometers square in size by the tail end of the formative period, about the same time as Teotihuacan was being established. This is a site with lots of earthen architecture. It was a large site. I've read that it had it's been compared to Babylon for having like hanging gardens and so forth within the city. But unfortunately, there's not that much known about it because one of the main excavators has refused to publish his data. Of the more well-known classic period sites, we're going to focus on 3 of them. The first that I want to talk about is the site of Tikal. Tikal is an interesting example because we're still learning more about Tikal. This was one of the sites that they discussed in the news just in the last couple of years because they are doing new laser scanning mapping of this area and have found that the site was even larger than we thought. So, the traditional estimate for size here is quite a large site at 123 square kilometers, kind of spread out over the jungle with 100,000 people. But I believe that estimate is actually going to go up shortly. So stay tuned for more information from Tikal. You may have seen Temple 1 at Tikal. If you like sci-fi at all, you may have seen this temple as featured as the Yavin 4 rebel base in the first Star Wars movie. So this is a site in Guatemala. I was able to visit about a year and a half ago. It has a really incredible set of monumental pyramids of a different style than we've seen in central Mexico. The pyramids themselves have temples on top of them, and the temples sort of wear headdresses in a way. They actually have these sort of combs of extra material that come up off the top and make the pyramids appear taller than they actually are. And in some of the reconstructions of these Maya sites, we can see that the buildings were, in some cases, painted almost as though they were alive. Some of them wore masks, some of them wore headdresses. So for Mesoamerican people, the buildings were alive in a sense, almost like social actors. The next site that I want to discuss is the site of Copan in western Honduras. Copan is interesting because it has a downtown civic ceremonial core, just like some of the other sites that we've talked about, but it also has a really impressive architectural feature that you don't really see, which is the entire earthen acropolis on top of which the buildings are constructed. This reminds me a little bit of the site of Monte Albán in Oaxaca, in that the largest investment of human labor at this site isn't in the buildings themselves, but rather in the leveling of the entire landscape that was used to make the downtown of the site. Copan is also known for having lots of intricately carved and really amazing standing stelae, and these stelae, because they have Maya writing on them, tell the story of the dynasty of rulership at Copan, and we can actually see some really specific details. So, for example, one of the most famous kings of Copan, known by the day he was born as 18 Rabbit, we can actually see both in the histories written at Copan and at the nearby site of Quirigua, we can see the story that for decades Copan controlled Quirigua, almost like a colonizing force. And then Quirigua rebelled, captured 18 Rabbit the king, decapitated him, and then celebrated that event in essentially political propaganda at the site of Quirigua as it became more powerful, having escaped the control of Copan. Now at Copan, in order to downplay this rebellious event, they don't talk about it as much. So you can see here how, though it might appear to us like it's just art, this hieroglyphic style of carving was actually used for political propaganda. Finally, Copan is really famous for the longest script ever written in Maya hieroglyphs in pre-Hispanic times, which is actually not a book, but rather a staircase. The Copan's hieroglyphic stairway is the longest known text in ancient Maya hieroglyphs. And you can see here it's actually been covered in modern times in order to keep the acid rain from dissolving the staircases. And if you look online, and I've posted some links as well in the weekly module, they're actually working on three-dimensional modeling of this staircase in order to preserve as much of it as possible for the future. The next major classic period site I want to talk about for the Maya region is known in part for its unusual architecture of having a standing multi-story building, and this is the site of Palenque. So you can see here at Palenque this particular palace with its iconic four-story tower. And Palenque is also famous for another structure which is known as the Temple of the Inscriptions, which, as the name implies, has lots of writing on it, particularly in the temple at the top, but also was found to have a massive tomb inside it. An excavator in the 1950s discovered that the floor of this building was collapsing, and because archaeology is a slow process, it's done as a science, we excavate very carefully. It took this excavator and his team something like 3 years to dig down the staircase and ultimately reveal the crypt within the temple. So inside the Temple of the Inscriptions is the famous tomb of the King Pakal. This tomb is known for the very elaborate burial of Pakal himself and the famous jadeite mask that's a mosaic mask that he wears, and also for many rich offerings that were left with the body and so forth. It's such a large tomb and it has such a large sarcophagus that actually the temple was built around it. They first built the tomb and then they built the temple around it. And the sarcophagus of the King Pakal is a really famous example of Mesoamerican art. And we know from these inscriptions, as well as from other writings at the site, a lot of detail about Pakal. We know when he was born. We know how long he ruled. He had a long life and a long period of power at the site of Palenque. And because he appears to have inherited the kingship as a child, for a while his mother, Lady Beastie, or Lady Sakkauk, was the ruler of the city, sort of while he was growing up to become old enough to control the kingdom. Now, unfortunately, the sarcophagus lid, with its really elaborate carving that shows Pakal descending the trunk of the world tree into the underworld at death, and then eventually emerging as a star or as a constellation of stars in the afterlife. Unfortunately, this has been interpreted by pseudoscientists in a really silly way on programs like Ancient Aliens as potentially showing a spaceman taking off in a rocket ship. That interpretation really just is ignorance of Mesoamerican artistic styles and cosmological beliefs about the underworld and the world tree and so forth. So I think it's much more interesting to try to learn about what this really meant to the Maya rather than speculate about spacemen and rocket ships. Now, another topic for our discussion of Mesoamerica, and one that has been quite mysterious and has been a major topic of discussion, is the collapse of different major cities at the end of the Mesoamerican Classic period. Now, this collapse appears to, rather than have been a single event, it appears to have been more like a process. And it gets started in central Mexico. So the site of Teotihuacan, as I mentioned previously, appears to have some kind of internal struggle, perhaps related to the religious cult of Quetzalcoatl and human sacrifice. And some kind of revolution, some kind of civil war, we believe, caused the fall of that city around 8600, something like that. And then in just a few short centuries following that, perhaps because interaction and trade across Mesoamerica was so important and these cities had become sort of interdependent, city after city collapsed. We see Monte Alban collapsing by a couple of centuries later. And then the Classic period Maya cities collapsed by about a century after that. So what does collapse mean? Well, it doesn't mean that all of these people disappeared. The Maya never disappeared. There are still millions of Maya people today. But rather what we're talking about is the collapse of political organizations. So we see population levels at major cities decline significantly. Some of them are abandoned. Some of them appear to be reoccupied only by small groups of squatters or perhaps people returning to do ritual. And we see the cessation or the ending of the building of monuments. They stop building these major pyramids. In some cases, it's really dramatic, like the hieroglyphic staircase at Copan. You get to the top few tiers of that staircase, and they just stopped carving. It's almost as though at the end of the Classic period, the carvers just set down their tools and never returned. And if we think about the economics of supporting these monumental constructions, what that means is that the rulers no longer maintained the wealth or had the power to get people to make monumental constructions for them. We see that the carved stones depicting rulers they're no longer produced. Not only do we see the end of many of these practices of monumental carving, but they also seem to lose some of the knowledge of writing. I mean, it's kind of a dark ages in Mesoamerican history. And in general, the ruling dynasties who had passed power down from king to king and from king to queen and so forth, they seem to fall apart. And to the extent that new power will emerge after this in Mesoamerica, it appears to have been through different kinds of political strategies. As part of the Mesoamerican Classic period collapse and into the post-Classic period, we see an increase in evidence for warfare, more technology dedicated toward weapons, more evidence of capturing people and committing human sacrifice, and in some cases, murals, like you can see here in this painting from Bonampak, showing people actually going to war in elaborate costumes and sacrificing their enemies. But other things may have been related to this collapse as well. For example, at Copan, it appears as though the community essentially used up too much of their own resources. They cut down too many of the trees. They started farming the hillsides, and eventually their terraces on the hillsides collapsed. And a decline in agricultural fertility basically led to malnutrition and starvation among the community. So ultimately that city was abandoned. So because Mesoamerica is such a diverse area geographically, there are multiple theories of collapse during the Classic period, and it's not as though one of these is probably right and the rest are wrong. It's more like these apply to different parts of Mesoamerica at different times. So in some cases we see evidence of environmental degradation and land overuse, as I just mentioned at Copan. We see evidence of internal conflict and revolution at Teotihuacan, general evidence for increasing warfare in multiple areas of Mesoamerica. And then in a broader climatic sense, there may have been a drought at this time globally that could have sort of triggered some of the decline in crop productivity. But the Classic period collapse was not the end of major political organizations in Mesoamerica. In fact, the largest and probably one of the best known Mesoamerican societies was the Aztec Empire. And the Aztec Empire emerged in the post-Classic period. And in fact, the Aztecs were actually immigrants to Mesoamerica. They weren't really from Mesoamerica. They had come from the north. So you can see in this map here sort of a rough outline of the Aztec Empire and the different kinds of states that empire contained at the time of the arrival of the Spanish. Now, as I mentioned, the Aztecs came from somewhere in northern Mexico, or people have even suggested the American Southwest, and they moved into central Mexico at the beginning of the post-Classic period. And as they did this, they met many other Mesoamerican societies, some of whom had kind of collapsed at the end of the Classic, others who had started to build new cities after that Classic period collapse. And one of the cities that kind of came to fluorescence at the very tail end of the Classic and into the early post-Classic was the site of Tula. Now, when the Aztecs got to central Mexico, they explored sites like Tula and Teotihuacan and found mysterious things at Teotihuacan that they couldn't explain, that they thought were built by the gods. And at Tula they found a group of priests who were renowned and revered throughout Mesoamerica as a group of sacred priests who could help establish kingdoms in other parts of Mesoamerica by doing things like giving ritual nose piercings and so forth. So the Aztecs, who were actually foreigners to Mesoamerica, spoke a different kind of language and so forth, kind of modeled their own society on the Toltecs at Tula and kind of actually stripped some artifacts from the site and sort of made themselves more like the Toltecs in order to justify their position in Mesoamerica. Now, the story of the Toltecs is an interesting one, and it relates to that conflict that we talked about at Teotihuacan between the cults of Quetzalcoatl and a god that was perhaps a precursor of the later Aztec god Tezcatlipoca. At Tula, there's evidence for a cult to Quetzalcoatl. There is similar evidence and lots of indications of contact between Tula and a distant site in the Yucatan Peninsula known as Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza has iconography of the feathered serpent. It has architectural styles such as you can see here at the Temple of Kukulkan, which is another word for Quetzalcoatl, that is similar to Central Mexican styles. And so the real similarities between Tula in Central Mexico and Chichen Itza on the Yucatan Peninsula have been taken to suggest maybe a case of migration, that people from Central Mexico actually migrated hundreds of miles down to the Yucatan Peninsula. This would actually fit the legend that the Aztecs told the Spanish. The Aztecs said there had been a great war at the site of Tula between the followers of Quetzalcoatl and the followers of Tezcatlipoca. The followers of Quetzalcoatl were defeated, and the feathered serpent god, or the priest representing him, said he left for the east, and he said, "I will return in the year 1 read." Well, as fate would have it, the year 1 read in the Mesoamerican calendar was the year that the Spanish arrived to the coast. And so it's likely that, at least for a little while, some of the Aztecs believed that the returning or that the arrival of Cortez was actually Quetzalcoatl returning as had been predicted by prophecy. The site of Chichen Itza, in addition to its connections with central Mexico, is interesting in its own right. It has the largest ball court in all of Mesoamerica, a huge ball court with high stone discs where you would have tried to hit the rubber ball through the disc. The ball courts have lots of carvings down the side showing human sacrifice and the relationship of the ball game with politics and religion. Also, the site of Chichen Itza is famous for the observatory building, which looks a little bit to me like the White House and is actually similar to a structure that was built by the Aztecs in central Mexico. So the Aztecs arrived to Mesoamerica after that place had gone through the Classic period collapse, and after even some early post-Classic cities had risen and fallen. And they really kind of found Mesoamerica somewhat a disjointed landscape because of all this political collapse. And beginning as a group of mercenaries hiring themselves out for warfare, the Aztecs gradually established greater and greater power and built themselves a home base, built themselves an island on the Lake Texcoco in central Mexico, where modern Mexico City is found today. In fact, Mexico City as we know it, the largest city on earth, is really basically mapped out over ancient Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs. At least the downtown part is. For example, if you've ever been to Mexico City, the great Zocalo, the great square at the center of Mexico City where the presidential palace is, that was the great square of the Aztecs. And right near the famous colonial church in that square was the Templo Mayor, the greatest temple of the Aztecs. So the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan was an incredible architectural accomplishment. It probably had up to 200,000 people at its height. It was essentially built on a human-made island in the middle of the salt lake of Lake Texcoco. And it was connected to the land by causeways. There was a series of dikes that allowed the Aztecs to control the flow of water. It was a real architectural marvel. In fact, to travel around the city, one in many cases would use a boat, sort of like traveling up and down the canals of Venice. In fact, if you get a chance to visit Mexico City today, there is still a neighborhood known as Xochimilco, which is the Nahuatl or Aztec word for the place of the flowers, where the ancient Aztec canals survive, and you can actually travel up and down these sort of old-fashioned flower farming market on the ancient Aztec canals in longboats. So when the Spanish conquistadors first arrived at Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan was at its height and was larger than almost any of the cities in Europe. It was cleaned on a regular basis. The people bathed regularly for ritual purposes. This was at a time when Europe had recently gone through a plague. Europeans believed that bathing more than once every 6 months was bad for your health. In comparison, the Aztec city was clean and well organized and had all kinds of interesting inventions that we take for granted today. For instance, botanical gardens, aviaries, butterfly gardens, acrobats, circus performances, a game similar to soccer, large marketplaces with domesticated foods. We owe many of these things to the Aztecs. So this site was really, this city was really a clean, beautiful, highly structured settlement. The Aztecs had very specific laws. They had rules about who could do certain things in public. They had beliefs about if you were born at certain times, you could grow up to do different practices in society. So this was really something that shocked the Spanish when they first saw it. Now, in the image on the right, you can see the size and shape and reconstruction of the Templo Mayor, the grand temple of the Aztecs, as it would appear if it were laid over the modern downtown square of Mexico City. In fact, the colonial church that you can see in the background of that photograph is made out of the stones of the Aztec Great Temple. So when the Spanish were finally able to defeat the Aztecs with the help of native warriors from the state of Tlaxcala who were tired of the Aztecs' imperial dominance, the Spanish actually made Aztec people tear down their own most sacred temple and build a Catholic church out of those stones. Now, when the Spanish first met the Aztecs, they were stunned by what they saw in terms of ritual practice and belief as well. The Aztecs believed that the only way to help the sun get across the sky and help their god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird warrior god, in his battle to get the sun across the sky every day, was to practice human sacrifice. The gods needed human hearts and human blood in order to defeat the powers of darkness. But the Spanish, when they saw human sacrifice on the scale of as many as 10,000 people in a day at Templo Mayor, and huge skull racks of sacrificial victims, the Spanish thought that this was the work of the devil. And so we can see that this was clearly sort of a conflict of cultural practices that ultimately led to the first great defeat of native societies in the beginning of the colonial period. Here is a stone version, a stone replica of an actual skull rack that was used and had actual human heads on it that the Spanish saw when they got to downtown Tenochtitlan. Now, I want to point out, again, the Aztecs did not fall just because the Spaniards had, as Jared Diamond wrote, guns, germs, and steel. The Aztec Empire fell for multiple reasons, but among them was other Mesoamerican societies were tired of the Aztecs' powerful empire and human sacrifice, so they actually joined the Spanish and sent as many as 100,000 Tlaxcalan warriors to help fight the Aztecs. Also, it's important to note, in a big picture philosophical sense, the true conquest of the New World was never accomplished. Many Mesoamerican beliefs persist today. Native Mesoamerican languages persist today. Millions of people with native Mesoamerican blood persist today. So the Mesoamericans have never disappeared. And yet, if we look at this moment in history, the arrival of Europeans to the New World, the illegal, even by Spanish law, conquest of the Aztecs by Hernan Cortez and his conquistadors, as well as 100,000 Tlaxcalan warriors, and ultimately the conquest of the Inca under Pizarro, and later the arrival of Anglo settlers to what's now the United States, and the process of moving westward through Manifest Destiny and either eradicating native peoples or forcing them onto reservations, and the death of as much as 90% of the native population in the first century of the arrival of the Europeans due to diseases. I believe that this series of events, this process, the quote-unquote conquest of the New World, is perhaps the most drastic human disaster, the biggest humanitarian crisis that's ever happened on our planet. I do just want to point out again that this is a big process. It involves native politics. It took centuries. It was not just guns, germs, and steel, as has been written in that book by Jared Diamond. So there's so much more to say about Mesoamerica. It's a fascinating place and time and area. And I do teach another class about Mesoamerica if you want to get into more detail about it. Unfortunately, in this class, because it's a global overview, we just can't spend enough time on Mesoamerica.